Hello, bonjour. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University here in Ottawa, Canada. And I also have the real privilege of being the project director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. LERRN is a partnership between researchers, civil society partners, and refugee leaders in Canada and other parts of the world, but especially focused on the needs and the opportunities identified by our working groups in East Africa and the Middle East. Through research, training, capacity building, policy engagement, and public dialogue, we're working to better understand and enhance the role of civil society in the functioning of the global refugee regime, especially in pursuit of protection and solutions both with and for refugees. I'd like to begin today's webinar by acknowledging that the land on which I reside is the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I say this not out of protocol, but out of respect, and out of recognition of my status as a settler Canadian, but also in recognition of the fact that the issues of dispossession and dislocation that we'll be discussing today are also part of the history of the territory on which I reside. With that, let me say how delighted I am to welcome you all to this webinar. We had over 150 participants registered from 4 continents around the world. Welcome to this third webinar in the LERRN-IDRC's series. We have a fabulous group of speakers today to help us engage with this really timely and important question of refugee leadership. And how local perspectives on the issue from both the East Africa context and Middle East speak to global policy discussions on this issue. As we'll hear, since 2015, we've really moved from the question of if to how. Within the New York Declaration and the Global Compact on Refugees, there's a real emphasis on the need for refugees to be included in decision-making. So our conversation today is really to learn from the lessons of how refugee-led responses were at the forefront of responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. What lessons can we draw from this as we imagine what the international refugee system that turned 70 yesterday, how can refugee leadership be part of the effective functioning of this system going forward? You can join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag #BuyRefugees. So please use that hashtag if you're tweeting out quotes or impressions from the webinar. And if you have a question that you would like to pose, you may use the Q&A box or use the Twitter handle @learning. We really hope that you enjoy this webinar and everything that it has to bring. I'm certainly looking forward to it. This is a very important part of LERRN's work and my own research and policy engagement work. I'm looking forward to it. I thank you for joining us. I thank all of the speakers and those who are involved with this. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Kathryn Toure, who will be offering some words of introduction. Kathryn, as you will hear, is the Regional Director for Eastern and Southern Africa for IDRC, the International Development Research Center. An interesting fact in connection to this topic is that Kathryn started her career in New York City in refugee resettlement before various posts in different parts of the world, including at the Center for International and Comparative Studies at the University of Ottawa. She's worked in West Africa with Africa Online, the educational research network in West and Central Africa, and eventually as director of IDRC's West and Central Africa Regional Office, before she moved to being director of the Regional Office for East and Southern Africa, based in Nairobi. She's the author of many books and articles and holds a PhD in education from the Université de Montréal. Kathryn, we're delighted to have you with us today, and I give you the floor for some introductory comments. Kathryn, over to you, please.
It is my honor to say a few introductory words. First, it is a privilege for Canada's International Development Research Centre to partner with LERRN for this webinar, the third in a series under the leadership of doctoral student Jennifer Kanji and Professor James Milner. My name, as James said, is Kathryn Toure, serving as Regional Director for IDRC in Eastern and Southern Africa. I work here in Nairobi with a dynamic team of about 30 people from a dozen different countries, all of us teleworking currently. I welcome our guest speakers and everyone participating from across several continents. I'll say a few words about IDRC, which is a Canadian Crown corporation that is part of Canada's international development and foreign policy efforts. For 50 years, IDRC has been funding research and research organizations in the Global South. Currently, our work is in line with Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy. Some of the work we fund is gender transformative in that it asks questions that get at the root causes of discrimination. IDRC is about to launch a new 10-year strategy aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. Our new strategy will bring into focus the issue of forced displacement. This work will build on our experience of working at the intersection of forced displacement with issues such as governance, human rights, digital innovation, and climate change. Relevant to today's discussions, our modus operandi at IDRC is to support leadership of researchers in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America in identifying challenges and aspirations, in generating needed knowledge, and in identifying workable and sustainable solutions. In other words, ensuring local leadership and strengthening local organizations to propose evidence-based long-term solutions and policy options is part of our DNA. This fits directly with the theme of this webinar on refugee leadership and participation. Why refugee leadership and participation? Because refugees are knowers of their experiences and need to be part and parcel of decisions that affect them. It is paradoxical that much of the world's forcibly displaced populations, including refugees, are hosted in countries in the Global South. Yet, much of the research that influences policy and practice with regard to refugees is produced outside of the Global South. Local knowledge is overlooked and underused. Also, international compacts and agreements on displaced populations need to better reflect the interests, priorities, concerns, and perspectives of refugee communities and host communities in the Global South. Part of the conversation today has to do with highlighting the importance of amplifying their voices in these global processes. The COVID-19 pandemic, which we are all experiencing in different and similar ways, points to the necessity of supporting localized responses and initiatives. At a time when international actors have been constrained in their mobility and access to affected populations and communities, local actors and refugee-led organizations have been at the forefront of protecting members of their communities from COVID-19. I am very much looking forward to hearing from our panelists and our two moderators on this important issue of refugee-led initiatives and participation in global discourse on matters concerning refugees. Thank you very much. Welcome once again, and back to James or to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. Merci beaucoup. I'm very grateful for your participation into IDRC's continued leadership as we pursue the localization of knowledge production and engagement. And with that, it's a real joy to introduce my co-moderator for today's webinar, Mustafa Alio, who is something of a legend in discussions of refugee participation. Mustafa's day job is as co-founder and managing director of Jumpstart Refugee Talent, a refugee-led organization that facilitates meaningful employment and entrepreneurial opportunities for refugees. He made history in 2019 at the Global Refugee Forum in Geneva by serving as the first refugee advisor to a delegation of Canada to a meeting of the international refugee system. He's a visionary global leader on issues of meaningful refugee participation in the refugee regime and has been a leading voice on these issues for several years. There's no one better than Mustafa to guide us through today's conversation. The topic of refugee participation is so important and timely, really for two critical reasons. Number one is the global policy commitment that we now have to refugee participation, stemming from the Global Compact on refugees, affirmed by the UN General Assembly 2 years ago this month, actually 2 years ago tomorrow, with the clear commitment for refugees to be involved in planning and in programming, But second, as you would have read in the blog that I co-authored with Mustafa, Pascal, and others, is the very critical role that refugee-led responses played in the early response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Mustafa, over to you for some words of introduction and context, please. Mustafa?
Good morning, everyone from Toronto, Canada, and here. And thank you, James and Kathryn, for the introduction. Really excited to have this conversation today. And we hope this is one of many conversations that are happening globally early on, just kind of on the rise of the necessity for including refugees. And slowly, we hope those conversations to transition into action, and getting excited to witness that along with many other refugee leaders across the globe. I think I want to start always with numbers in a way in my remarks. Refugees has doubled since 2012. And if you think, everyone knows this, but I want to also to bring it a little bit forward, not to go past. By 2050, we would have over 1 billion migrants in the world. So the issue of working and trying to change the narrative and also working with refugees and working with as many new actors, it is needed today more than ever. Yet those close to the ground tell you that oftentimes decision on how funds get spent or made by huge public and private sector organizations do not reflect the true need of refugees and are not necessarily driven by what will be the most effective. The reason for that, are complicated. That can be involved politics, greedy motivations, or often just the lack of refugee-centered insight. On the other hand, as part of the effective population, local and refugee-led organizations on the ground truly understand the needs and priorities of refugees and can react rapidly to crisis. Just we've seen that in COVID-19, but this is kind of bring it a little bit up only in COVID-19, but everyone knows that refugees have always been the first and the most consistent responders to the issues that are happening in those ways. They often are freer to prescribe ways of doing things or a strict procedure for decision-making, which inhabit the efficiency of a huge entity. They are also better able to mobilize local resources and already have the trust of the community. Their project implementation is fast and effective. And while we talk about the refugee inclusion and decision-making and necessity to partner with refugees and increase of resources for them and other local actors, on the rise, we've seen this, unfortunately, and very disappointing, to see that resources are not combining with this kind of a rise of notion. Based on Amnesty in 2019, less than 1% of humanitarian funds went to local and refugee-led organizations. It used to be 2%, less than 2% early on. Today, more than ever, to emphasize and admit that by refugee work plan is the smart path, not only the right path. To implement better with refugee work plan that create new and effective solutions for refugees. Joining me today to definitely, the conversation today is among those actors, the states, the refugee-led and community leaders in different places, and also the UNHCR. We understand that with the power dynamic and even from refugees, there is no need and there is no ask in terms of like it's either or. We need to work collaboratively, all of us, to achieve better and more effective tools. I hope today our speakers and panels will give you some perspective and then also our questions to engage into a meaningful conversation that hopefully transition into actions at one point sooner rather than later. Thank you, James, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Mustafa, and thank you for all of your leadership on this space. We look forward to you moderating the discussion time that will follow after the presentations. And now we have our first speaker. I'm really delighted to share with you an introduction to my colleague and co-author on the blog and other pieces and a very important leader in this space, Pascal Zigashane, who joins us today from the Kakuma refugee camp in the northwest of Kenya. Pascal is executive director for at Action pour le Progrès, a refugee-led organization in Kakuma that's focused on empowering youth in transformative learning. Pascal, I like to say, there are 8 refugee-led organizations that have been successful in registering as community-based organizations in Kenya, and Pascal has been the director of 2 of those organizations. He brings with him deep practical experience, not only his work with Action pour le Progrès, but also his work with the Jesuit Refugee Services, with the Kenyan Red Cross, but deep training and knowledge with his education in this space. He's currently pursuing a bachelor's degree in healthcare management at Southern New Hampshire University. He holds a diploma in social work from Regis University, a certificate in psychosocial case management from Utah University, a certificate in journalism from FilmAid, and a certificate in forced migration from Moy University. He's very accomplished, a very passionate, and a real leader on the ground. And so Pascal, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I'll call up your presentation, and Pascal, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you so much, James, for the kind introduction, and also Mustafa for giving Kenya, Kakuma, the voice in this webinar. So my name is Pascal Zigashan, as James said. I am a refugee in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. I am from Congo. Today I will be sharing something with you on refugee leadership beyond the pandemic. And I developed 4 points, and I'm sure that we are going to look at all those 4 points as we go forward. And I saw it's very important for the audience to understand the role of refugee-led organizations so that we might not misinterpret the role of refugee-led organization. Refugee-led organizations provide valuable skills to their fellow refugees when they come in the camp and when they stay also in the camp. They also promote cultural coexistence and peace, because we have refugees from different countries, almost 20 countries, and every country has its own culture. Then you can imagine how the interaction, how it's very difficult, but we try to promote cultural coexistence and peace. But also we try to advocate for those who are extremely vulnerable. Some come from a very poor background where there is no education, and then we try to advocate for these people. We also try to create markets for other refugees in the camp. The clear example is that there are those we are linking to online jobs, but also we represent the views of many other refugees, as I am a live experience right now. We also provide leadership when international and national actors are unable to access the camp, like this time of COVID. And international and national staff were unable to come to the camp, and we did stand to provide leadership for our communities. We also provide or do awareness on community health care and physiotherapy. As you can see in the picture, we are trying to create awareness. And we also manufacture sanitizers and liquid soap that we've been able to distribute to the community, as we all needed this during this time of COVID. But also we provide electricity to enhance the development of the refugee community. That's the example of Okapi, which is a refugee-led organization providing electricity to the camp. We also create employment for refugees by initiating projects. We get to get some positions for our fellow refugees. James, we can move to yes, thank you, James. Now, as Action pour le Progrès, what have we been able to do during this pandemic time? We've been able to provide food to our fellow refugees. We've been also able to provide face masks to a quite number of refugees, and also sanitizers to our fellow refugees. And we've been able to train 30 community residents on healthcare and physiotherapy, so that we're just trying to prepare the community. If anything worse happens, these 30 residents can come in and support the clinic staff. James, we can move to the following slide. Yes, as you've heard from the roles and what Action pour le Progrès was able to do, we also have a lot of challenges, and these challenges came out from all the refugee-led organizations. I was able to contact them, and we came up with this kind of challenges that we all experience. One is lack of funds. We don't really get funds. And how do we try to mitigate it? We always try to encourage refugees to be volunteers, and then we can ask them to contribute, to make a small contribution of $100 US to see how we can make our activities survive. We have difficulties in getting legal status of the organization. Currently, registering a community-based organization here in Kenya is really getting tough for us. It's completely difficult, despite the effort that is coming to help. But we try to address the legal status concerned to the UNHCR, and UNHCR have established CASI, but it is not yet to get this done. We are not included in decision-making. Refugee-led organizations are not included in decision-making. In fact, we are consumers of what has been decided. We just take it that way. We wish to be in decision-making. And we are currently establishing Kakuma Refugee Network to address this problem, because for us it's a pressing issue. And we are bringing all the CBOs together and other refugee leaders to form a Kakuma Refugee Network so that we can address this. We also face the challenge of support in terms of liaising with external good-willing individuals. Sometimes we get people who want to come to the camp and see our activities, but getting these people in the camp, it becomes difficult. And what we are doing currently, we are just talking to the Refugee Affairs Secretariat, which is the government office in charge of the camp, to see how they can help. And we are also facing negligence from agencies when addressing vulnerable cases. We have agencies working in the camp, providing services to refugees. They do neglect refugees. And what we are doing, we are also trying to see how Kakuma Refugee-led Network can address the issue. We are also facing the lack of higher education opportunities. Refugees have access to primary and secondary education, but when it comes to the university, the line there, it's very down. So it's really a problem. And as refugee-led organizations, we are trying to reach out to people to see if we can get a partnership with education institutions who are willing to partner with refugees so that we can have this opportunity. And lastly, we have refugees in the camp who cannot be resettled. Their cases have been rejected. Some got the third country, but during the interviews, they were rejected. What we do as refugee-led organization, we try to help these people to appeal for their case. That is what we do. Yes, James, you can move. Yes. Now, as the audience listening to me, and UNHCR is going to celebrate 75 years of existing. And if you look at that 75 years, refugees are still coming in. In fact, the number is going up. And that also makes refugee-led organization to continue existing. And what I can ask the audience listening to me right now is to try to financially support a refugee-led organization to reach their visions, but also find some education institutions that can partner with us so that we can deliver this opportunity of university or tertiary education to our fellow refugees. We also want a kind of partnership that empower refugees to become self-reliant through livelihood, and also to ensure that meaningful refugee participation in decision-making. We are really asking for this to whoever is listening to me right now, if refugees can really participate in decision-making, but also employment market for refugees around the globe. I don't know how it's going to be, but I am quite sure that the audience, in one or the other way, they can find a way. But also to expand our reach in Kakuma and beyond to inspire positive change. So that is what I had to share with you, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for your point, and thank you for the substance that you brought, the very tangible perspective that we begin with. Thank you also for working within the 8 minutes that you had on the agenda. There's so much for you to share, and I look forward to hearing from you more in the discussion time. We then move from the East Africa context to the context of the Middle East, and we're just delighted to have Diala Ayman with us today. Diala is the Policy and Communication Liaison Officer for the Mulhan team. For Those of you who aren't aware of the Mulhen team, I strongly encourage you to find their websites online. The Mulhen team is a nonprofit organization that's aimed at providing assistance for IDPs in Syria, but also Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. This organization was founded by a group of students in 2012, and it's now registered in Turkey, France, Sweden, Germany, Jordan, and Canada. Since its inception, take note of this, since its inception, the Mulhen team has delivered over $20 million in programming in areas as diverse as support to orphans, shelter, basic assistance, medical care, and education. In her role, Diala is responsible for developing internal strategies and provides legal consultation for the organization's management team and the board. So she engages with different stakeholders in the work of the Mulhen team. She is a very passionate advocate on these issues, who holds a bachelor's in law and experience working with international NGOs in different contexts. She's currently in Canada working to be qualified as a lawyer here in Canada. We're very grateful, Diala, for you joining us. Diala, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James, and thanks to all organizers of this webinar for this chance to speak in this webinar. This is actually the first time for Mulhen team to be invited to participate in a public discussion about refugee work at this kind of level. Today, I'd like to say that I am very humbled to be speaking on behalf of Mulhen team, which is made up of extremely passionate, innovative, and energetic humanitarian young men and women who work day and night to provide help to their communities under the most challenging, the most difficult conditions. I'd like to start by giving some statistics about what we have been able to achieve in this very tough year. In 2020 alone, Mulhen team has managed to collect over $9 million, 91% of which come from individual donations with an average contribution of $65. And through these funds, we have been able to provide essential life-saving services in various sectors to hundreds of thousands of forcibly displaced persons in Syria and Lebanon, and also in Turkey and Jordan. Now, within the context of the pandemic, Mulhen team has been a frontline responder since the early days of the COVID situation. In fact, between April and May, the field teams continued to work on the ground. They distributed food parcels and hygiene kits to over 7,900 displaced persons in Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, and Jordan, while of course taking all necessary precautions. Now, during the same period, April and May, we worked on delivering food assistance throughout the holy month of Ramadan and the holidays that came after it. This is one of the most busiest days for the team. It was during the peak of the pandemic situation. We were able to reach over 39,000 forcibly displaced persons in the countries in which we operate. Now, prior to COVID, and like many other refugee-led organizations, Mulhen team has been a frontline responder before the COVID situation. Just back in August, when a devastating blast took place in Beirut, our team immediately launched an emergency crowdfunding campaign that raised over $28,000, through which the damaged homes of 130 Syrian refugee families were rehabilitated. This is actually just an example of the essence of the module of Mulhen team's work. We implement timely, rapid response during crisis and emergency, a fact that we believe actually distinguishes us from NGOs and UN agencies. I have a couple more statistics. This year alone, our unique case-by-case assessment program has benefited over 23,000 beneficiaries across the countries in which we operate. A very groundbreaking project, my personal favorite, that we began working on this year, is the design and construction of concrete block housing units with the aim of relocating displaced families from tents into these units that offer them more protection from weather conditions, more privacy, and access to basic services. So far, we have been able to build 960 units. That's in northwestern Syria. And the project is still ongoing. We received tons of messages from families wishing to be included in the project. Of course, we aim to expand on this project, but we need funding. Now, going back at the pandemic situation, it is worth mentioning here that while the world has been in an emergency mode for the past 9 months, Mulhem team and other refugees all over the world have been in an emergency mode for years and years. And because we recognize the importance of using funds efficiently, and because we know of the huge gap between humanitarian needs and the available financing, we are, like many local organizations, we have very low overhead costs. This is an aspect that we believe INGOs really need to reconsider. Now, going back to the realities on the ground, it is important to highlight here that, like many local organizations and refugee-led organization, Mulhem team faces many legal obstacles in, for example, in Lebanon, especially with the growing anti-refugee political rhetoric and also the economic problems. Our work there has not been easy at all. Now these obstacles that we face as local organizations are one of the main reasons why we would like to urge international actors to offer accessible funding opportunities to local actors like ourselves. There needs to be less reluctance to establish partnerships with the new local parties and not just old ones with whom networks have been built over years. One of the prerequisites that we feel puts local organizations at a disadvantage is the requirement for applicants to have previous experience in grant management from a previous INGO. Now, this actually makes it extremely difficult for any local organization to embark on their first opportunity, on their first funding project from an INGO. Now, another foundational element that has been spoken about a lot, but I would like to stress that also now, is the provision of capacity development trainings, especially for organizations that apply and actually fail to pass capacity assessment. Now, this is the most obvious and practical step towards supporting local and refugee-led organizations and putting words into action. Now, finally, I would just like to stress the idea that Mulhem team has grown from a small relief group comprised of university students to a well-established nonprofit organization with 13 field offices, which delivers diverse humanitarian and development programs with a budget worth millions of dollars, and this is with no governmental funding, no INGO funding. One could only imagine what added value there could be when international actors, especially donor countries, start to recognize the impact of refugee-led organizations and take substantive action to directly support their work. That would be all.
Thank you so much, Diala. And I think you really put your finger on two of these challenges that we can try to unpack. One is the catch-22 faced by refugee-led organizations, that you need the funding to get the experience, but you need to demonstrate that experience to be able to access the funding. And the second is the question of disaggregating the notion of refugee-led organizations, that there are some with the capacity to receive funds and to report on the use of those funds, but others with the nascent capacity that's there. And if we're able to build the capacity of those organizations, what that then means in terms of the number of refugee-led organizations that can enter into this space. That was very helpful. Thank you. But now I would like to turn to Stella Ogunlade with UNHCR in Geneva. We're really delighted that Stella is joining us, but really excited with what's been happening in the Partnership and Coordination Service at UNHCR. So Stella is the Chief of Section of the NGO and Civil Society team at UNHCR's Partnership and Coordination Service. So it's in this function that Stella supports UNHCR headquarters and regional bureaus in engagement with NGOs. And this is what's so exciting. Since 2020, that remit has been expanded to include engagement with refugee-led organizations. Ms. Ogunlade has worked for more than 15 years with UNHCR in protection, and since 2015 in the essential but challenging work of interagency collaboration and coordination. She's been posted in more than 8 countries, mainly in Asia, Africa, and Pacific, and she brings with her degrees in law from both Germany and Australia. So Stella, you're very welcome to this webinar. We're excited for the work that UNHCR is doing in this space, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Et bonjour pour tout le monde qui sont francophones. So I just want to maybe go a little step back before I talk about what we've been doing in 2020 and what we will be doing next in the coming years. Just to highlight a little bit that I do think that UNHCR has quite a long history of engaging with refugees. So it's not only today that we do realize, I think, all the values that it brings to engage with refugees when it comes to needs assessment, when it comes to programming and so forth. So for example, as James mentioned, when I started with UNHCR 15 years ago in Chad, we had, for example, in the refugee camp management committees that we would consult on all the different things we wanted to do, whether it's food distribution, whether it was registration and so forth. And we had the peaceful coexistence committees with refugees to ensure that they have understanding with each other or with host communities. So we've been using this for a long time, but we also realized in 2005, 2006 that we are not systematic. And when I listened to Pascal just now, I feel maybe you're not still always systematic. There's still a long way to go. But I would like to mention that in 2006 and 2007, we rolled out in all operations something what we call the tool for participatory assessments and age, gender, and diversity mainstreaming, which really obliged all staff members, but also our implementing partners, NGOs, and so forth, to really consult in a constructive manner in the whole program circle, from the needs assessment at the beginning of the year until the programming, but also providing feedback on what we've done with the information that we received from refugees in these assessments. And there was also more and more a tendency to have refugees participating even in our planning meetings and so forth. And then 2008, we also had another document, which is called Manual on Community-Based Approach. And I've put this all on the last slide if you're interested to read more. But since then, we even have community-based protection officers and moving forward. And I think now, with, as James mentioned, with the GRF, the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Forum on Refugees, we reiterated this importance of multi-stakeholder approach that really includes most and all refugees themselves. So involving them is really an obligation and a priority for the organization. Next. I wanted to just quickly talk a little bit about the definition, just to say that for us, when we talk about refugee-led organizations, we talk about organizations that are either founded or led by refugees as decision makers. And they should be involved, of course, in providing protection and assistance to refugees in different areas. We put this slide on just to emphasize as well that you don't see here the word registered, because I think this is one of the issues and the big challenges that refugees have and face, refugee-led organization faces. And when we want to engage now more and stronger, we want to engage also with those that are not registered yet or have faced other administrative challenges. Next. So in terms of categories, We actually did some internal mapping this year, and maybe some of you have met my colleague, Dana Al-Ansi, who unfortunately had to leave UNHCR, but she is the one who really reached out to a lot of RLOs globally to do a little bit of a mapping and to hear a bit more on how RLOs feel, what their obstacles are, what their issues are, how they themselves would categorize them, and so forth. And in the categories of RLOs, she came up with these 4, which says, you know, NGOs, but activist group, association, social entrepreneurship, but of course also the very loose, you know, groups of refugee-led organizations. Next. What are the advantages? I think we all know, and I think Mustafa and also James, you mentioned it, and Kathryn, you mentioned it in the beginning, you know, how important it is to have those people that we are, you know, serving and that we are working for, you know, to participate actively in everything that concerns them. But I just want to also reiterate again how important it is to have them being parts of the assessment, the programming, and the protection. It needs to be a bottom-up approach. We cannot talk about people without them actively being involved in whatever we do. So I think, you know, when there's still maybe certain voices that are still not convinced, these are one of the arguments that we have to reiterate, that whatever we do, our work will just improve by an active participation of refugee-led organizations and an active engagement. Of course, it enhances also our access to refugee communities because they know the others. They can access certain areas where there might be even safety and security risk and so forth. They understand the culture. They understand, you know, why refugees behave in this way or another way, or accept certain humanitarian assistance that we provide and not the other. So it again improves our own support. And then, of course, it's an advantage of empowering them. Refugees don't feel, you know, in the end, very respected if you just provide them assistance without them having any active participation when it comes to controlling their own life. So participation is a right that they have. It's a human right, as we all know. And by, you know, doing this actively, we really ensure that they, you know, feel empowered and that they take part and control of their life. And I think already when we started with these participatory assessments, like I mentioned in 2005 and 2006 in a more systematic way, we also noticed how much capacities they have themselves to address their issues that we didn't even always listen enough to, or not in a systematic way. So I think, again, moving forward, this is further strengthening that and helps to, you know, further empower them in the response. And of course, it provides a lot of opportunities for them to learn, to teach others, to be trainers for trainers, and to have leadership refugees development. And in the whole assist with the localization agenda that we're all talking about since the World Humanitarian Summit. So now what happened recently? I think we already spoke about the Global Refugee Forum, where you had a lot of refugees participating, but you also know that we have the global NGO consultations, where since 2015, refugees are invited not only as participants, but also as speakers. And then this year, we actually had more refugee-led organizations than even before, because now with the opportunity to have this conference online, we were really able to actively reach out to each region and to involve the regional bureaus in encouraging RLOs to attend. So that was really also another good way of hearing their voices at a global level. And then we have the Innovation Award that we developed this year. This is an award that should recognize all the work that RLOs did this year when it comes to the COVID-19 response. I think we all agree that they were in so many areas the first responders, and they did a fantastic work. And so we wanted to award that, and we wanted to award that in each region. So we have 7 winners this year, and they will be granted $50,000, which is just a one-off, but at least a start. It is also a way for us to be pushed internally again to look at, how can we award, funding, by maybe using a little bit more simplified processes. And maybe maybe next to show a few photos, and then I would like to come to that outlook. So here I think you see the High Commissioner at the Global Refugee Forum, and then maybe next you see some of the winners that we have this year, and there will be a ceremony soon. And you see from each region of the globe, we had really interesting projects on different things related to COVID. Now, to come to the outlook, which I think, no, let's go next. The challenges, I think we've heard a lot, but I can come back to that again. But in terms of the outlook, I think the most important thing, and I think Diala mentioned it now several times, is about funding. But at the same time, there's also a need to build capacity. And I think you, James, mentioned that catch-22. So we are looking internally and how we can address that. And one way is that developing simplified partnership agreements. I think the High Commissioner has also announced this at the Global Annual NGO Consultation. So our colleagues have already started working on that. And we're also working on something that could be first interim that we can maybe already do earlier, while these agreements might take longer, but definitely something that is a bit simpler than the agreements that we have with international NGOs. Then there's a need for capacity building. There's a need for capacity building for refugee-led organizations themselves, of course. And I think Diala and Pascal mentioned quite a few of those issues, so I don't need to repeat this again. But of course, there's also need for training for ourselves. So we are now working internally on some kind of training and guidance package to push also our own colleagues, to better engage with RLOs, to really make them participate in all kinds of work that we do. For example, also active participation in coordination structures is another thing where we need to dig deeper into it, and to raise also the awareness of our colleagues on the importance of it. And then we do some mapping, and I think to come back to the RLO award, when we did the award and we engaged with the bureaus, we actually found out also that many bureaus or even country offices didn't even know that many RLOs. So mapping, so this award helped us actually to map them out, because then a lot of RLOs contacted us to be part of it. And now this is making all our mapping more comprehensive. I think in some regions we had up to 200 RLOs that contacted us. And so we want to do this more systematic, bring this all together, engage with them, assess them, see what their needs are, and help so in this way to engage in a much stronger way. So maybe I end there. I have much more to say, but I think that maybe comes up in the discussion.
No, Stella, that's wonderful. Thank you very much to you, and thank you to Melissa for facilitating your presentation. If you're able to send a copy of that presentation to us, and if you're willing for us to have it on the website along with the presentation report, I think viewers will find a lot of richness within that. Stella, I was really encouraged with the notion of awareness raising and capacity building, not just for refugee-led organizations, but within UNHCR itself, to be able to see a refugee-led organization when you encounter that, and to be aware of that. And the awardees, one of the speakers on our last webinar on refugee education was Abdullahi Mire with the Dadaab book drive. And so we were delighted to see him receiving that award for his tremendous work. It's a very exciting opportunity for partnership, and so I thank you for that. Just as I'm grateful to welcome Gillian Gillen, who's joining us today with Global Affairs Canada. Gillian is the Director of Humanitarian Policy and Global Engagement at Global Affairs Canada, has been a champion on these issues for quite a while. And the fact that Gillian is taking the time to speak publicly on these questions, I think it really speaks to the endorsement and the enthusiasm with which the government of Canada engages issues of refugee participation. In our first webinar in this series, we heard from Ambassador Bob Ray, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations in New York, In his report, there's such an emphasis that's placed on the question of refugee inclusion. Gillian is extremely well placed to speak to this, not only from her current position, but her previous role as director of the Gender Equality, Education, and Child Protection divisions at Global Affairs Canada. Gillian brings deep experience and a real passionate commitment to this topic. And so, Gillian, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. The floor is yours.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Mustafa, LERRN and IDRC, and really thank you to my fellow panelists. Really quite inspired and share a lot of the same messages actually that you're passing on this morning. So I'll get right in and start by talking a bit about, as James said, our commitment on behalf of the Government of Canada to meaningful refugee participation, some of the challenges we face and many donors face in this space, and what we're doing to try to address those challenges. So as others have made reference with our feminist approach to international assistance, and our gender responsive humanitarian action within that, refugee participation has been deeply grounded in that policy, and our engagement is reflective of that. The policy is grounded in a human rights-based approach. And part of this means aiming to protect and promote the human rights of all vulnerable and marginalized groups, including refugees and other displaced persons. Increasing their participation as equal decision makers is at that core. It also actually talks about transforming power relationships and accountability structures between international humanitarian agencies, local actors, crisis-affected people. That transformative and empowering vision is a part of our policy that guides our work. It also means supporting the development and role of local and national responders and helping create the space to give them voice. And it also means being mindful of the many different intersectional elements of those voices across the community. So just wanted to start off by speaking, though, that's really, grounds the work and our engagement in this space. Clearly, with that basis, improving support to local and national actors and refugee organizations is a priority for our humanitarian assistance program. And we think it's essential to improving the effectiveness and efficiency of humanitarian aid writ large. I would say that it's also a view of ours that this isn't just a responsibility of donors alone. It's really for, as I said, the system writ large. It's a shared responsibility between INGOs, UN agencies, donors, and local actors. And just from this diversity of this panel, we can see how all of us are coming at it and working towards that end. So what have we done ourselves as Canada? We have done quite a bit of work, and I think others have spoken to this in terms of integrating meaningful refugee participation into our policy and advocacy work. James and I were together a year ago in Geneva at the Global Refugee Forum. Sorry, Mustafa, did I say James? So Mustafa and I were there on the delegation, and that was such a wonderful and rich experience to have Mustafa join us. And so we had that implicit as a demonstration of our commitment to the pledge that we had made to support meaningful refugee participation. But we also were doing it through preparatory meetings ahead of time. We had refugees who participated in the build-up to the GRF, and we also signed the joint pledge with the GRN on meaningful refugee participation. And since the forum, we've gone on to continue to work collaboratively to try to institutionalize this type of participation in our delegations. And again, this year I should say, at at UNHCR's Executive Committee meeting in October, we had another refugee participation as an advisor to our delegation. So really happy to see, a lot of progress in this space around our policy dialogues. This engagement isn't new, as others have said. I think Stella was saying, for UNHCR, Canada has long worked with the Canadian Council for Refugees for the purpose of advising Government of Canada refugee policy and programming, not just Global Affairs Canada, but IRCC Canada. And we look forward to broadening this with the newly or currently being stood up refugee advisory network here in Canada. So as you know, others have said, and as the conversation has brought us together, the pandemic of COVID-19 has made all of this more important than ever. And so I think, you know, we've all talked about how there's been a lot of progress in the advocacy and policy. And, you know, others have said about how we've made a good case for why, and it's really unpacking the how we can get there. And so part of our approach that I'll talk to is not only what we've done in terms of our own policy space, but in advocacy to our partners and also around some of the programmatic things we've tried to do. So in terms of advocacy with partners, you know, as I said, we are grounded in this policy that is our feminist approach, that really the role of local and national partners needs to be a part of consultation, design, delivery throughout, and that has been core to our messaging since we've had, you know, the Feminist International Assistance Policy. I think another key piece to our advocacy work with all of our partners is around predictable and flexible humanitarian funding as a really important tool to not just ensure that there's a flow through of funding from us as donors, but really part of that advocacy is towards building these long-term partnerships, which I've been really pleased to hear, you know, I think almost all of you speak to. And I think that that's a really key thing coming out of this conversation today, and that I wanted to emphasize is that building of partnerships. So there's some challenges, of course, and many of them have been raised already. I think I'll just speak to a few. There's the obstacles around, as a donor, of course, the issues relating to providing direct funding because of due diligence criteria that we have. This is linked to our accountability requirements, to our parliaments, and to our taxpayers, and is a challenge for many donors to get around. It links to some of the things that others have said about capacity building. And so that's one of the kind of core obstacles, I would say. Another is, as others have spoken to, the ability to become registered within country as an RLO, and the different legal barriers or other barriers that are faced as a part of that, whether or not it's, as I said, capacity, limited funding, security challenges too. I think another thing also worth mentioning is knowledge. And Kathryn, you spoke to this right at the start about how critical local knowledge is. And that's true for us too when trying to make funding decisions about direct funding. You know, us as a non-decentralized humanitarian program don't have that same depth of level of knowledge of what the local interests are and dynamics at play. And we're very conscious of needing that information and that being so critical to, you know, making direct funding decisions. So in the space where there's many challenges, how have we looked to work around this or to address this in terms of really some concrete programming components? For the humanitarian program, we really recognize the unique ability of the country-based pooled funds in how they are able to provide funding directly to NGOs. They, I believe, are currently transferring close to 30% of their funding directly to NGOs. And so we have increased our funding significantly within the humanitarian program from 6.5 million in 2016 to 50.15 million in 2020 to country-based pooled funds, recognizing how this is a really great vehicle and mechanism for us to ensure that local organizations are recipients of that funding. There are about 4 other initiatives that I'll try to quickly go through. I'm cognizant of time, that colleagues across the development program within Global Affairs Canada have been working on. Some of you may be familiar already with the Canadian Fund for Local Initiatives, CFLI. This is a contribution program that's delivered through our Canadian embassies and high commissions that support small scale and high impact programming and projects in countries. It funds approximately 600 projects annually with an average contribution of 28,000 per project. There are examples of some of these projects taking place in refugee contexts, This is accessible for RLOs through our embassy's local call for proposals. So certainly encourage this as a space to, if you're not aware of them, become more aware of these in your country. And in fact, programming, recognizing the value of this program, the total funds for it have been increasing across the department. So that's moving in a positive direction as well. There's also Women, Voice and Leadership and the Equality Fund. These are two funds that really kicked off around the launch of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And are both of them in different ways, and they're set up in different approaches. I won't go into too much detail, again, mindful of time, but both of them look at strengthening the capacity of local women's rights organizations. And baked into them is looking at including institutional capacity building for network and alliance building, and for really helping movements within the countries that these organizations work. The Equality Fund is really an innovative, long-term approach that's looking to develop sustainable sources of funding for women's organizations, bringing together philanthropy, private sector, and civil society. So there's some innovative things that the department is doing in that space. And then finally, I'll speak to picking up what Pascal was saying about the importance of education. Very soon we have a launch in January or early 2021 around our Minister Gould's mandate letter had a commitment to leading an international campaign to ensure that all refugees and displaced children get education and the needs that they deserve. And so I think that's going to be an exciting space to watch in the new year. Part of that will be the inclusion and the creation of a Refugee Education Council to provide technical and strategic advice to the minister around ensuring that campaign is really grounded in the voices of refugee children, youth, parents, teachers. So beyond those specific issues, another point I want to raise is just the importance of a nexus approach. And I think, I feel like we can't have a conversation these days without talking about the nexus, but I think this is one where it truly is baked into what all of us have talked about partnerships which help build capacity. When you think about from a humanitarian perspective versus development, it's really bridging that space of the, before, during, and after. And I think the importance of crowding in development actors into our space, into funding and supporting refugee-led organizations is really key. And I think those examples that I just gave is examples of how we're trying to do that as a department. So I'm conscious of time, but I really wanted to say that I think it's these comprehensive approaches that across the humanitarian and the triple nexus, let's say, are so important to continue to build collaborative partnership approaches that let us collectively work through these issues that we've identified around capacity building, risk sharing, accountability, and really get us to unlocking the how. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And I think your last point of moving from the if to the how is this critical moment. And speaking of the sort of the nexus approaches, it's why we've been so excited with LERRN and our partnership with IDRC is our ability to draw on the deep strength of an organization like IDRC and its value added in bringing forward those localized perspectives, those thought leaders into these integrated approaches, into the nexus approaches, and amplifying those voices into global spaces. So it's a very, very exciting moment on many fronts. We did start this webinar a little bit late, so I'm going to ask the audience's indulgence for another 20 minutes so that we can have 10 minutes for a round of questioning. That makes it sound very intimidating. A round of discussion led by my co-moderator, Mustafa Alio. We have already received questions from social media and the Q&A box. If members of the audience have other questions they'd like to add, please put them in the Q&A box. Mustafa, I'll turn it over to you for about 10 minutes. I'll then pose some questions to our panelists and invite them to reflect on those from what we've received on Q&A and social media. I'll then call on Kathryn to say some words to close us off before I announce the details of our next webinar, and we'll do all of that in the next 20 minutes. So thank you for everyone's engagement. Thank you for everyone staying online. Mustafa, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you to all our my colleagues and panelists on the on this. It was really interesting in the beginning to hear from Pascal about the kind of the challenges that they're doing, but yet at the same time for Action pour la Progrès is that all the work Pascal, if maybe many people don't know, actually he led 2 refugee-led organizations out of the 8 were registered in the Kenya. So definitely that's a lot of, but it's still the lack of funding is an issue for them. I think with Diala, it just my response came from Gillian. I was looking at her when she was listening to you, and then she was like, wow, and on those numbers, and still, and I think that just kind of a confirmation. I'm going to disagree a little bit on the catch-22 concept. While this exists still with many organizations, but an organization like the Action La Progrès or even Moham team, they're out of that catch-22. They already proven this. If you kind of put it into numbers, Mulham team in 1 year in 2019, they got 140,000 donations coming from people in that way. When she put it in the way, $9 million with $65 in average. I also want to thank Stella for being here, and definitely there are promising steps UNHCR has been taking recently in just kind of trying to engage with refugees, and I want to commend your acknowledgement that still you have a long way to go. I'm going to stand corrected only on one thing, Stella, that we did not have a lot of refugees in the Global Refugee Forum. There was only 70 refugees out of 3,000 and something. That's less than 2%. It was great for us to be there, but definitely we need to improve on this. And I really commend UNHCR for trying to explore different things. I think the Innovation Award is a great thing that you guys are doing. And that being said, with Canada, I really admire Canada progression and even like kind of progress in terms of supporting refugees and have them to be in the decision making. And hopefully those would be a concrete steps toward bigger initiative and bigger changes in the future. And on this note, Gillian, Canada's feminist, and my first question would be to you, Gillian. Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy places strong emphasis on basically inclusive approaches and bring to underrepresented voices, especially women and girls. On the other side, also, Bob Ray's report emphasized the support of refugee-led and local organizations, especially refugee-led organizations in that report. But still, how can organizations like Mulham Team, who I know they have a mandate to have 50% of their management team to be women, refugee women in that sense, and also kind of with Action La Progrès, how they can actually reach and be partner and benefit in helping Canada to basically implement the Feminist International Assistance Policy places. On the other side, how can Canada reach the refugee-led organization to ensure and empower and encourage the refugee women leadership and involvement in refugee responses?
Well, thanks, Mustafa, for putting me in the hot seat first. But to say that I think, some of what I mentioned initially in my talking points really speaks to how it's pushing on an open door in terms of our policy and the framework that all of us are working to within Global Affairs Canada. As you said, we've got this policy and this foundation. And as I said, I'm quite proud of the different and innovative programming that exists that's out there and that is accessible. And so, often it can seem that there are a lot of barriers, and there are certainly a number of challenges, as I mentioned, but there are these windows that I've mentioned, and thank you to whoever added links into the different programs. So I think, ways and direct routes, as I mentioned, is through the CFLI. The Equality Fund is really getting off the ground, and it actually has had a COVID-19 direct granting, that they began to have a COVID-19 response fund, but that over the life of it, because it is really looking at sustainable sources and funding, is going to have future granting windows that open up. And so we really do encourage that interested organizations and movements check the Equality Fund website for future opportunities, because it's not just, you know, a here and now that exists, it's going to be a longer term road. And so I think that there are a few different avenues for that really concrete engagement. But I think that, as I said, there's, you know, even just our conversation today is an example of us engaging and working together. And so, you know, as I spoke to it, there is everything from the policy space, where there's inclusion within the policy space and talking, there's the advocacy messages. And I really think that also, I didn't emphasize enough that the mapping work that Stella has spoken to, having things like that really help build those bridges. Because I think some of it is the unknown of who is out there and who can we be having conversations with. So I think that creating that knowledge base, and as I said, part of the conversations like this are doing just that, is really key.
Thank you so much, Gillian, for this. And my next question would be, go ahead, Stella, if you want to add any comment.
No, I just wanted to comment, Mustafa, on what you said in terms of the GRF. I was actually not referring to the GRF, I was referring to the global NGO consultations. Since we are organizing it, that team, I know that better than the GRF thing, but I'm more than happy to let the GRF team know that you're unhappy and we have to invite more. But I just want to say, you know, I think it's important that we have meaningful participation. And, you know, we didn't have the time to go through my whole presentation in terms of challenges, but we don't want to have tokenistic kind of appearances, if you know what I mean. Yeah, so I think like having regional and national RLOs talking also at global events, or having them being part of whatever happens at the region and at the country level is very important. Not just, you know, shouldn't just look at numbers, but we really need to look at the content and of who we are inviting. So sorry, back to you, Mustafa.
No worries, and thank you for the clarification in that way. And we could go on and on, like even with the NGO consultation, I can give you some numbers, but I mean, definitely it's a way to work on. I think, Stella, the second question is definitely giving that UNHCR core mandate is to safeguard and the rights and the well-being of refugees. And given what we heard today, especially from Diala and Pascal, and about all the initiatives being done through UNHCR and Government of Canada, how can refugee-led organizations better connect with the UNHCR to access support and build an equal partnership that and ensure that UNHCR basically mandate is realized? I mean, now after that innovation award and the mapping of all of this, so how can refugee-led organizations, you know, connect with you better to help you realize your mandate?
Well, that is a tricky question. I mean, I think it's both ways, no? Like I said, I think we as UNHCR need to be reminded to reaching out better. And if you know who is where doing what, let's put it this way, then we can also reach out more. If we have a partnership agreement established, then, you know, we can do some sort of tender and RLOs can also contact us and apply for it. But I think, you know, refugee-led organizations should also be active in reaching out to UNHCR colleagues and offices and NGOs and saying, look, we are there, this is what we are doing, this has been working well, you know, can we work more together? I think it's not a one-way road. I think it's on both sides.
Fair enough. And I think my last question would be the most tricky question in a way that, and I hope that to hear potentially from all of you. Recent research coming from the refugee study program at Oxford documented that more than 90% of refugees in Kampala reach out to refugee-led organizations as basically the first responders or organizations to talk about. Likewise, LERRN research in Kenya documented the barriers that refugee-led organizations face when it comes to funding. This rises, and I think I mentioned also in my introductions about where refugees are not happy. I always say that there are billions of dollars being spent in refugee regions, and refugees are fleeing those billions of dollars. This raises an important question of trust. we increasingly basically hear that there is an erosion of trust from refugees toward organizations and the UN bodies that their mandate is to protect them. At the same time, we see that kind of trust in working with refugee-led organizations on the other side, and we heard one of them. How can refugee-led responses play a role into rebuilding that trust? How can also government states like Canada, UNHCR and others work with refugee-led to rebuild that trust? If I put so much investment and programming in all of that, and people are not interested in this, and they always have that kind of a concept, I can tell you, Stella, we help Jumpstart work with few organizations to submit their application to the Innovation Award. There was some, few organizations like, this is just a talk. They know already what organization they're going to pick and all of that. But then we have to lead those conversations. How can those collaborative approach and refugee-led organization really support rebuilding that trust? Maybe I want to give the floor first to Diala, then Pascal, and then any comment coming from Gillian and Stella would be really appreciated on this. Diala?
Yes, Mustafa, I think that the issue with trust when it comes to Syrian people in particular is very delicate, given that what Syrians see on the news is that there are millions or billions of dollars being pledged, to humanitarian aid. Yet every year when it's winter time, people are drowning in their tents. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Diala. Go ahead.
Okay. People are drowning in their tents. People are dying out of extreme weather conditions. It has been ongoing for 9 years. This is, of course, when it comes to the basic problem, this is a political problem, and there are no humanitarian solutions to political problems. But I think that there needs to be more funding. There needs to be more participation of refugee-led organizations, which leads to rebuilding this trust with the communities that are affected, that are really just are losing faith in the international community as a whole. It's not just the UNHCR, it's not just the INGOs. They're losing faith in all humanity. They're just going back to their own communities, and that's where they feel that they can really trust.
Thank you, Diala. And Pascal, go ahead, please.
Coming to your question, Mustafa, I think in terms of building trust, I will first give a lived experience of you as Mustafa, who made a history. You being part of the delegation of the Canadian government, bringing you into the delegation, it brings trust with other refugees in Canada, according to my understanding. So it's a really good example that maybe I could encourage the government of Canada to keep that trust, because when we see Mustafa going as a refugee, even we in Kenya, when we saw the post, we believed something good is going to come out of that. And when it comes to the trust again, I will share another example of a fundraising campaign that I participated in this year, the Need List. So, and again, I can even take this to be an advice to UNHCR and whoever is listening to me. Like, it was a fundraising campaign that involved some refugee-led organizations, and the fundraising campaign, every organization involved was able to see the single amount of money being dropped in to support their project. And at the closing of that fundraising campaign, the money went direct to the refugee-led organizations. So I think that kind of transparency, that kind of involvement, as many of you said, the kind of involvement, the kind of engagement will really bring this trust in supporting and ensuring that refugees are able to see what is allocated for them, the huge amount that is allocated for them. For me, that is what I can say for now.
Thank you, Pascal. Gillian, Stella, any comment on this? Gillian?
Yeah, well, and thank you, Pascal, for speaking to the trust that we built and shared in going to the GRF. I think, you know, when I think of trust, I think of risk and building, you know, that they're two interwoven concepts. And I think of, you know, the expression that a problem shared is a problem halved. And so, you know, this is part of a big conversation around localization and the need to look at risk sharing and accountability. And so I think that building trust is at the core of really unpacking what are the different risks that we're talking about. And for all sides and all parties inside, what are the different issues around accountability that we need to unpack to kind of work together to sort of look at what are the solutions through that partnership approach that we've all talked about today, and how can we, you know, share this responsibility collectively.
Yeah, from my side, I think the whole question comes back. I think maybe Gillian mentioned it when we talked about accountability. I think it's about, accountability to affected populations. It's about feedback mechanism. It's about doing things together, as I said at the beginning, that we are together from the assessment over the planning, over the programming, back to what have we now done with the money that we got, how did we implement, what did work, why didn't it not work. If we do this the whole time together, then I think there is less of a risk to be mistrustful, you know, and it goes to, if RLOs and refugees are our equal partners that are side to side, then it's the same as, I don't know, UN agencies and NGOs. They surely also have their moments of mistrust, but overall, I would hope we trust each other and we see each other as equal partners. So I think if we get there the same way with refugee-led organizations, then there will also be trust among each other. So it's really sharing information, doing the things together, implementing together, evaluating together, and moving forward together.
Thank you so much. I'm really going to end it on really very strong points, Stella, that you mentioned. It is about equal partnership. There is a lot, when we say equal partnership, a lot of people miss the fact that equal partnership means basically try to dismantle that power dynamics that happen usually in the international community. We need to think and say it more and think it a little bit deeper every time we say we want an equal partnership with refugee-led organizations. That means if they don't agree to something, it should not happen. If they suggest something, basically collaboratively, it should be discussed and going forward. So I really thank you for this. Maybe if anyone today leave anything that I want to leave is that to rethink and emphasize an equal partnership with refugees, for refugees. James, to you, and then on the panel question.
Thank you, Mustafa. It's a very powerful point. I note that we're 2 minutes away from the top of the hour, and so we have gone a full 15 minutes over time. Here's what I propose. I will send. We've received 8 very compelling questions through social media and through the chat box. What I propose to do is I'll send an email to our speakers and to our moderators with the questions, and I'll invite feedback on those questions by email. And what we'll do is we'll give that some time, and we'll include those responses in the report that we're preparing on this webinar. So there's an opportunity just for any reflections on the questions we've received around the power of networks, best practices, around the role of refugee-led organizations in changing narratives, on the kinds of mechanisms we can explore, on the question of how best to build capacity, and also a very challenging question on how we use the term refugee in refugee-led organization. Given that not everyone benefits from status, are there others that lead organizations? Are there opportunities for solidarity? But how do we make sure that we don't efface that? I'll say a few words of closing in a moment, But first, let me give the floor to Kathryn Toure back in Nairobi for some final words from IDRC's perspective.
Thanks so much, James. And I have the honor and the pleasure of just thanking our panelists and our moderators. Pascal, we've enjoyed hearing about the work of Action du Progrès. We encourage you, Diallo. We've learned about the Mohen team and the commitment of you and everybody who is associated, and we thank you. Mustafa and James, thanks for moderating us today. We've been able to hear from Stella at UNHCR and also from Gillian from Global Affairs Canada. So thank you for this discussion. Conversation, we've had a lot of conversation and no action today, right? Sometimes we can get frustrated with talking. We can get frustrated with conversation. But you know what? Conversation is part of social change. Us coming together here, trying to cross boundaries, including power boundaries, and to discuss as part of social change. And important issues have just come up about alliances, about trust, about equal partnership. And I know that this conversation will continue and the conversation can be translated into meaningful action. I would like to say that the IDRC partnership with LERRN at Carleton University, what is at the heart of that partnership is actually ensuring that the voices and experiences of those closest to forced displacement are heard and are fed into various different forums, both to address humanitarian approaches and policy approaches. So this is what's at the heart of our partnership with Carleton. And my final word just is to say that this is the third in a series of webinars. And so I think when we turn it back over to James, we will hear about the fourth session, important conversation that's coming up in 2021. So again, a real pleasure to engage in this conversation, to learn with all of you, and to continue to work together going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. Thank you to all our speakers. Mustafa, as always, such an honor to work with you. Thank you to all of the participants who stayed on the line through all of this time. 3 very quick public service announcements. Number 1, our next webinar is extremely exciting. Save the date, the afternoon of the 21st of January, 2021. LERRN will be co-hosting with IDRC and with UNHCR and the Global Academic Integrated Network 2 panels as part of a virtual global academic conference that reflects on the 70th anniversary of UNHCR statute, an anniversary that we marked yesterday. I was so moved when I saw the High Commissioner's tweet yesterday when he said how much he hopes that UNHCR does not celebrate its 80th anniversary, with a sincere hope that UNHCR is out of business because we have found solutions to the challenges of displacement. Join us on the 21st of January when we will discuss North American perspectives on UNHCR's mandate, both in the North American context and from the perspective of North American actors engaging with the global refugee regime. One of the speakers will be Mustafa Alio on a panel on North American engagement with the refugee regime. Critical that it will be the day after the inauguration of a new administration within the United States. And so a very critical moment to talk about a forward-looking agenda. Second, please complete the survey that you will receive after this webinar, and stay tuned for the report on this webinar and a link to the recording. As I said, I will pose the 9 questions that we've now received to our speakers and ask for any responses that they would like included in the webinar report. And finally, it's my real pleasure to be able to announce that an important part of LERRN's work in 2021 and 2022 will be focused on refugee participation, with the very generous support of the Open Society Foundation, of the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation. We're anticipating support from other foundations as well. LERRN, in collaboration with its working groups in East Africa and the Middle East, in collaboration with the Refugee Economies Program at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford, will be conducting an 18-month study on refugee-led responses in East Africa and the Middle East. This is something we've discussed with Pascal, Diala, and a number of our partners. We very much look forward to bringing forward evidence that can help us move forward in the conversation on how to ensure that protection and solutions is pursued both with and for refugees. It's our very last webinar of 2020. My sincere thanks to the LERRN team, to our partners at IDRC, everyone who makes these webinars possible. For those of you who are still watching from home, I hope you are safe and well. Let me extend my very best wishes for the end of 2020, and let us all hope that 2021 is a year of peace and healing. So with that, I send my sincere thanks, my best wishes to everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. We'll see you in 2021. Thank you so much.